Hello, and welcome to the Heathen's Journey podcast. I'm your host, Siri Vincent Clough, and I'm so glad you're here. This is the show where I explore heathenry through a queer lens. We will be talking about traditional witchcraft, runes, folklore, and so much more. Join us, won't you, as we journey to the ends of the 9 realms and back. Welcome back to another episode of the Heathen's Journey podcast. It's certainly been a time. Before I dive into this week's interview, which is oh so juicy, I need to first comment on the continued presence of white supremacist Asatru groups. If you watched footage of the coup at the United States Capitol, you likely saw some people wearing runes. There was, of course, the horrible North American Viking shaman guy. You know. The one with the headdress who was shirtless and had his face painted as a Confederate flag and had all of those tattoos. But there were many others. I have said again and again on this podcast that I condemn white supremacy. I understand the history of why Norse symbols in particular are constantly used. Listen to episode 2 to get a more in-depth history. I know that it's naive and even harmful to say that these people aren't pagan. Heathenry, like any other faith, has extremes. But from everything that I've learned from elders in the heathen community, what I see when I see white supremacists rallying under the banner of Asatru is that this is not rooted in our folk culture as Nordic Germanic peoples. I would argue that the Asatru Folk Assembly, the Wolves of Vinland, and other white supremacist Odinist groups that are not approaching heathenry as a true faith, but rather they use heathenry as a quote-unquote religious institution. This allows them to recruit in places where they would otherwise not be able to. It is well known and documented that these hate groups recruit in prison, and they are able to do that because of their religious tax status. So what can we do to interrupt the prison to Asatru Folk Assembly pipeline? Do prison inreach. If you are heathen and have a firm grounding in the faith, do the prison work necessary to provide an actual real education on heathenry to those who are seeking incarcerated in prison. Build relationships with people who are incarcerated. I firmly believe that incarceration itself is inhumane and the entire prison system benefits off of white supremacy. So of course, that's where a lot of the recruiting happens. But this also means that a lot of people who are incarcerated are looking for healing or meaning or some kind of guidance, and they're finding it in these white supremacist groups. I know a lot of heathens who are amazing, radical people who do prison inreach, and they all talk about how critical it is to view incarcerated people as people and how essential their work is. So get involved where you can. If you are not ready for that, another thing you can do is get loud. Talk about your faith as a Norse pagan loudly so that people understand that this path, the root culture and heathen ancestry, is not the same as what the Asatru Folk Assembly and others like them do. The best thing we can do is make the Asatru Folk Assembly irrelevant to those who might be seeking heathenry. I used to be ashamed to be a follower of Odin. I used to not want to talk about it because I didn't want people to think I was a white supremacist. But now I know that centering anti-white supremacy and anti-racism in my faith and what I talk about is the way people will actually know that I'm not a white supremacist. And actions are more important than words anyway. Don't just virtue signal, do the work. And if you're white and following a different pagan path, especially if you're following a European pagan path, you need to get loud too. I know that there's plenty of white supremacy in other European, non-Norse pagan spaces, but it's not talked about as much. This is insidious whiteness. It is a whiteness that doesn't recognize how embedded racism is in our society. Do the work. And to my pagans of color, your path is valid. I see how hard you are working and just how much shit gets thrown your way. I want you to know that you are always welcome around my fire. And I also want you to know that it is, not on you to do the anti-racist work in these spaces. You should be able to practice your faith without feeling like you have to constantly educate others. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for all of the work that you do. I'm working on a resource list on my website that is both groups to avoid because of overt white supremacy, like the Asatru Folk Assembly, as well as anti-racist heathen groups and initiatives to support. I wanted to have it up by the time this podcast episode aired, but I also started the second year of the Witchcraft Immersion on Sunday. I've also honestly been taking time to process and be emotional. It's been a week, let me tell you. If you would like to be notified when this resource list is up, please subscribe to my newsletter, link in the show notes. And if you know of a heathen group that should be added to the list, whether that be a racist heathen group or a welcoming and anti-racist heathen group, please reach out to me on Twitter or Instagram. So, on to a very awkward segue into highlighting my guest for the week. Marcus McCoy is an alchemist, herbalist, and blacksmith that you might know as Trollcunning Forge. His career in the occult arts spans decades, and he is a wealth of knowledge in so many areas. This interview barely begins to scratch the surface of his knowledge. We talk about his interests in the materia magica, history, and alchemy, as well as what it means to be an actual practical alchemist, which is very different from what you might think. There are a lot of misconceptions about alchemy that come from both armchair ceremonial magicians as well as New Age people who took ideas of transformation and transmutation without learning the source material. Some of Marcus's frustration with this is very apparent in this episode, and I think it's very valid. New Age in particular tends to water down or appropriate a lot of much older traditions. We definitely see that with the boom in shamanism and entheogens. The New Age frame of mind also tends to look at spiritual practices to see how they can revolutionize those practices or bring them into a modern construct. But you can't revolutionize a practice, in my opinion, until you fully, deeply understand it, especially something that there is already a lot of misconception about. So this is where that frustration comes from so often with, traditional witches, magicians, and alchemists. I will also note, before we get into the interview, that I had a hell of a time editing this episode. There were a lot of audio jumps and cutouts at the very beginning of the recording process, thanks to my internet cutting in and out and recording via Zoom. So his introduction to his work is a little bit choppy. Here's the cliff notes. Marcus studied anthropology in school, got connected with ideas of South American shamanism, studied under an actual shaman from I believe it was Bolivia, for many years in the traditional pre-ayahuasca fad way, and decided to follow other interests as well as shamanism out of a frustration with not being able to practice what he was originally taught. This led to his interests in perfumery and herbalism, which led to his current partner introducing him to alchemy. Context is important, which is just why I wanted to, share that. I think that Marcus has a lot of influences that come through in his work, and especially in this interview, and it's just so juicy to see all of that coming together. Anyway, I've blabbed on long enough. On to the episode.
Hello, welcome to the Heathen's Journey podcast. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
It's good to be here.
So I have already given a little brief introduction of you and your work, but in your own words, how have you come to be this alchemical blacksmith? How did you get started in blacksmithing? How did you get started in your magical path? Just give us a little intro of yourself.
Oh, well, if we were to start at the beginning, it's a pretty long story, so I'm not going to get into all the little details, but obsessed on the spirit world and being able to interact and see the spirit world for personal reasons at the time. And so I was really interested in that. And he turned me on to conversations with Ogotameli, which was looking at anthropological interviewing for understanding a culture's metaphysic and ontological systems. And that got me started with a really good foundation in, how to understand both my own and other cultures, worldviews, spiritually, magically, etc. So we come from a scientific materialist culture with a dash of remaining Neoplatonism. So, of course, I was going to be like all about that. Okay, you take a physical substance and that shows you the spirit world. Okay, right, because they're somehow linked, and so I got really interested in that, and then studying all the different cultures that worked with plants that were visionary. But, I didn't grow up Bolivian. I didn't grow up Peruvian. And so I studied all these things that were still kind of foreign to me. And those were like the ideas of folk magic that were like a given. A lot of people still project and have brought like new age ideas, of like personal ascension and, what I think is really masturbatory self-perfection sort of spiritual path work. There's shadow work and all these things. And they bring that to the work with these plants and these animist cultures. And that's not really how it's approached. It's not about becoming this perfect being, for the most part, you're treating supernatural illnesses, whether that's caused by a supernatural being or by a malevolent practitioner of magic or by the evil eye from a jealous neighbor or something to that effect. And so it was those things seemed to be the most common things that were being treated by these, visionary plant shamans, and so I became very interested in that. And then that, of course, led to an interest in witchcraft, and then a cross-cultural examination of witchcraft and folk magic. And the more I explored it, the more of course, I was like finding tons of commonalities. And I was really interested in just like, because that's really missing, like you don't see it in the neo-pagan scene. I mean, there's and you just seriously don't see it in the ritual magic, ceremonial magic lodges. There's an aversion to doing no magic, in both communities, and that is really telling, because they have a very new age and also like a psychological development sort of like pathway, transpersonal psychology view
it's
to
very
it.
Scientific.
Yeah, and Jungian, like almost. Mm-hmm. But there's an aversion to doing magic that isn't just the self-improvement sort of personal growth sort of thing. Unless it's healing or like in the neo-pagan standpoint, healing and protection and things like that, divination and things. But you don't see people throwing hexes at each other as much in that community, which I think it has a lot to do. And I don't go off on this tangent too often, but I believe that has a lot to do with the privilege of the people that participate in those traditions, is that they don't need to see physical real world results all the time, and so it can be a very intellectual, spiritual, developmental practice for them. But I was very interested in that because you don't see it. It's not here. And so I'm down in South America. I'm learning to be a curandero for all purposes, but I want to, there's no one coming to me for, well, I've the evil eyes on me. Mm-hmm. Right. It'd be more like, I want my aura cleansed, or I feel like I need to do some shadow work, or, like things like that, and that really started bothering me, in that you couldn't really there was very little crossover, but at the same time, culturally between South America and North America and stuff. But then I started studying, well, what other cultures, so Hispanic culture in general throughout, North America and Central America, they all still have those same commonalities, but so do so many other cultures. And so I started looking at all of these cultures that still believed in curses and hexes. And there's a lot of Americans still that do. But they have a tendency to be pretty marginalized people, and not these people of privilege. And I also found that really interesting. There's class divides with all of that as well. So here I am I've learned how to do this work, but I don't really have an opportunity to do it. So you get bored. And so you're like, all right, well, I don't really have much to practice, and I'm not going to be someone's psychological self-help guru with hallucinogens, because that just seems ridiculous, and that's not what I learned to do. So, that's what a lot of people are seeking, and that's what people have become to try to adapt to the needs of the Western audience, and that's what it is now, largely down there. With the exception, and I know a lot of Peruvian immigrants in the United States that are still practicing, not for Western, but for other immigrants, and they do it the old-fashioned way, like they're healers. They are doing what they do, but a lot of people, they just scoff at even that. They just reject it because it's become so new agey, so hippie, so far from its original context, that people, it's just a Burning Man joke at this point, so. And one of the things that informed me was a real interest in plant spirits, and that got me into distilling and perfume, because perfumerismo is a sort of sub-practice specialty of some curanderos within those traditions. And you extract the volatile spirit of a plant, which is its soul, its sulfur, and you have that in a bottle. And you work with it magically. And so I became really obsessed with that because it was so effective and it was so interesting to me. So I started learning how to distill. And I was really interested in distilling because I wanted to make my own from regional plants, local plants, and not sort of adapt what I had learned to working within a more bioregional standpoint. So I started distilling. I got really interested in perfume. I started a small business doing distillations of local plants and selling them. And then I met my current partner, Katamara Rosarium, and she had a essential oil and incense sort of witchcraft business.
It's a funny story. I actually use her manifestation oil.
Oh, cool.
Like to this day. And I didn't realize until I think you had posted on Instagram or something recently about like kind of highlighting her work. And I was like, oh my God, those two. Okay, cool.
Yeah. When I met her, she had gifted me that particular oil, and I turned it into a perfume and, gave it back to her, or part of it, kept the rest, and showed her, like the little things. And we started working on perfumes together and things. And that was a lot of fun. And then she had taken some courses with Robert Bartlett. So he was her teacher, and she was telling me, you're an alchemist. And I'm like, sure, okay. I mean, mostly when you hear people talk about alchemy, you're hearing like this kind of Jungian viewpoint on it. People are pretty far removed from lab alchemy. A lot of people don't even think it exists. I can't actually spend any time on Facebook forums on alchemy because it's so full of rubbish. The actual denial of lab work and the misunderstandings that come from people that don't do any lab work and aren't trained to do any lab work are amazing. It's absolutely amazing. So I just can't even. It just makes me angry. So I don't even go there anymore. But
how did a lot of this kind of transfer to blacksmithing? Because that's primarily like how I followed your work, is through like your smithing.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Long story short, I started taking classes with Robert as well, and I think it was during Secunda that I started, which is like the second tier of class or alchemical lab work with Robert. That I also had taken a class with Cody Dickerson on making a nail. And so I had blacksmithed the nail. Kat had gotten this thing or bought the class, paid for the class for us to take together just because she thought it'd be fun. And she wanted to support Cody. And so we went and took the class and I did the nail, and it just really clicked. The act of blacksmithing really, really clicked for me. And I felt so good doing it. Sore at first, but very good. It just seemed to suit me. So I took another class, and that was, we were making a hazelnut stang and made the little chopper to cut it down with and stuff. And it was during that in between classes, I think it was like maybe a week or two in between, that I had also taken the class with Robert again. And it just sort of, the idea, what we were studying at the time was how you, because a lot of alchemy and alchemy and blacksmithing and shamans actually like all have the same, they all come from the same nest. And they arise together in history from the same source. And you start to see that like when you're studying alchemy, like, oh, metalwork, all this metalwork, this, alchemy, like it was all swimming, together. And I started to, a lot of questions as to why people did what they did. And in these different occult traditions, like the grimoire blades, for example, that was a real obsession of mine for years. I mean, as a more esoteric herbalist, I was really curious about herbal quenches, and Daniel Schulke had talked about herbal quenches, and I think either Viridarium umbris or the Ars Filtron, and I had asked him if he could tell me more about that, and he was like, I wrote about all I know, and if you learn more, let me know. You tell me. And so, so that was really interesting. I was like, oh, well, I really want to learn more about that. What is that all about? And I had kind of I hadn't really thought about it, taking the blacksmithing class, and then I was taking the alchemy class at the same time, and it all just kind of like clicked. And then I confirmed it with Robert that. And it became the basis of the work that I do now, which is taking, and so I just became obsessed with the idea of like, well, this is how magical iron implements or steel implements were made. And we hear throughout history, I mean, we have, fantasy novels and cartoons and all these things that have the magical swords and role-playing games and all this stuff. So, we're inundated with that. But you start looking at like throughout history, there's like magical knives and magical swords and all these things, and ritual magicians pay to have these things made or whatever, and witches all work with athames and all this stuff. And you start looking at the history and researching the history, and there was a way, and it was through alchemy, that these things were created and imbued with magical properties. And so I became sort of obsessed with that. Okay, so like a magical knife, a magical sword, anything that's made out of steel, like you can imbue with other properties utilizing alchemical philosophy, and that is practiced through laboratory work. But the lab now becomes the forge, which the forge was also the place where alchemy was done. I mean, alchemists did a lot of metal work. I mean, we always hear about lead to gold, but they did so much more. So much more. I mean, we just distilled the oil of antimony, working with mercury, working with the precious metals. I mean, all of the metals of the world can be, or all the main planetary metals are traditionally turned into an alchemical oil, which can be ingested or used topically or used in a sorcerous sort of manner. And that became the other interest started for me to start looking at, Daniel Schulke's Ars Filtron and things. He's studied alchemy and witchcraft, and he's written about the subjects combined in his own sort of praxis. But you can start to see, I started seeing where he was seeing, like there's this link between alchemy and sorcery all throughout the ancient world and witchcraft that a lot of people, unless they've actually practiced some form of lab alchemy or understand it, would miss completely. And I find that with a lot of ceremonial magicians, as well as people working with astrological talismans and stuff, if they don't have like an actual background in doing lab alchemy, then it's like the fish not recognizing that they're in water.
Right. Yeah, so I have to admit that I actually know very little about alchemy, which is part of why I was excited to talk to you, so that I could learn alchemy from somebody who's like doing it in or not learn alchemy, but like learn about alchemy and have a conversation about it from somebody who is so steeped in kind of that practical alchemy. So, but what is alchemy to you? So like you talk about this sort of a fish not realizing that they're in water, like how do you bridge that kind of like knowledge gap almost? So like, what is alchemy? And then also like, what is practical alchemy?
Well, I'll tell you what alchemy and practical alchemy is not. It's nothing new age, and it's nothing what we would call pseudoscience today. And there's a lot of people out there that are trying to spearhead a sort of jailbroken alchemy, right? I'm trying to jailbreak alchemy, make it more modern, translate it all into transpersonal terms or new age consciousness, like theory concepts. And a lot of them aren't very well, even though they would say otherwise, they're not very well versed in traditional Renaissance philosophy or even astrology. And I'm not going to say that I am extraordinarily well versed, because I know lots of people that are more well versed on the subjects than I am. But I do know well enough to understand that alchemy has a really solid foundation in Neoplatonism, super, super solid foundation in Neoplatonism, but it also somewhat originated in Egypt. And so there's a lot of Egyptian influence with it as well, and influence from the Middle East and things that occurred. Alchemy sort of took a hiatus during the medieval era and sort of wandered all over to the Middle East a bit and sort of had a renaissance there, and so there was a lot of influence from all over the world during that time, because the Middle East was it's just an interesting hub. Mm-hmm. So we get a lot of really awesome astrological magic and talismanic magic and things like that got combined with it. But anyway, back to your question, is that what does it mean to me? To me, it's learning to understand the natural world and our place in it, and how to grow within it in a way that's ultimately healthy for you and the world around you. So immortality, these things, like lead to gold, things like that. And then you hear the psychological standpoint. It's like, oh no, those were metaphors. No, I literally just saw my teacher turn copper into silver like last month. like literally saw that. So it's not metaphor. We looked under a microscope and did different regions to test it, and it was literal. And a lot of people will think that I'm a crack for even saying that, but I saw it. It happened. It's true. It's real. It's not metaphor for the spiritual evolution, though that is a part of it too. There is a spiritual evolutionary sort of approach that happens, but it's not in the same lines as what people think in terms of consciousness development, from a transpersonal standpoint today. It's a little bit different. It's in that today, what we have today is informed by that, definitely, but it's changed quite a bit. We've taken out of its original context, mixed other things with it, and really muddied the waters. And so these ideas of immortality, a lot of what alchemy was focused on was creating medicine, and medicine prolongs life. So there's definitely a concept of immortality with that. And if you look at the alchemy was also used to preserve bodies, and it was working in Egypt. It was working with different concepts of death than what we're accustomed to today. So these ideas of immortality sometimes I think get a little bit confused. Do I think you can literally become immortal? I know a lot of alchemists that lie about their age to make people think that they're immortal, but I don't really think that. I think it's about health and developing, and if really prolonged life happens in the process, well, that's really fascinating,
Yeah, it's kind of like what I'm getting the sense of is that like material is also holy, like in a very real way in alchemy.
Yeah, you're taking things to the transmutation of one thing to its other. You can look at it like if you read Mircea Eliade's book, The Crucible and the Forge, which is really great because it talks about the relationship between alchemy and blacksmithing and metalworkers and stuff throughout history and cross-culturally. Now, granted, Eliade is considered somewhat of a armchair anthropologist, scholar, but he still makes some really great points as a classical scholar looking at these things. And the way it was viewed was that these different metals, would start with, I think, what is it? I think it's lead, but they go through a gestation period. They were considered like the bones of a god that were the bones of the earth that sacrifice itself to make this planet, right? And these bones of this deity go through the gestation period in the womb of the earth, and they slowly become the other elements over time. Over thousands of years, they become, like lead will eventually, all these, mercury, silver, iron, and so forth, tin, and then eventually, like gold. So, and not in that order, but the perfection is gold, and so that gold becomes the perfect state, and it's the full evolution. And so the Philosopher's Stone and these ideas of gold, this spans alchemical culture actually, and there are alchemical cultures. There's alchemy in India and alchemy in China as well. And
I was actually going to ask you about that because as you were talking about alchemy in the Middle East, I know one of the small slivers that I know is that Chinese alchemy looks very different.
Very similar too. And so is Indian from India. Like Indian alchemy is also very similar. They utilize a lot of the same laboratory techniques, and they talk about a lot of the same things because they're working with the same stuff. We're literally working with nature through observing nature to help nature move along, to evolve to its there's a hierarchical sort of like viewpoint of it, like a higher state that they're helping things move to. So a lot of times with like a spagyric alchemy, we're helping something get to we're removing things from its gross state and then moving it onto that to the higher state. But you can also take things, and this is where you get into like compounding medicine and things. You still see this in all the cultures that have these advanced compounding medicine traditions that are still very alchemical in their roots, is that you can take different elements, whether it's mineral, animal, or vegetal, and then combine different elements of each together to take their properties and virtues to make them do certain things. And so that's the same approach that I take to blacksmithing magical implements, because that's the way that they approach making magical implements. That's how it was done.
That's a good, that's a great segue into kind of some of my questions about blacksmithing specifically. What are some of your favorite materials to work with? Like what do you love to kind of produce through Trollcunning Forge?
I really enjoy working with sandmai. I think it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. Damascus is also really fun to work with. And there's some really beautiful, really talented Damascus makers out there. There's a guy that I've been getting billets of Damascus from. He makes this, it's a Japanese, it's kumai, which is like it's like a copper, which is like a type of what we call Damascus now, which is really just pattern welding. But it's pattern welded nickel and copper, and it makes beautiful Damascus patterns that we're familiar with Damascus, but it's copper and nickel, so it's really a beautiful contrast. But then that is forge welded onto steel, and then he does a sandmai sandwich with that. Wow. It's insane. It's really, really cool. From a cultural standpoint, and say, like throughout Japan, perhaps that's probably acceptable, but in like the Western, if you were to read like Agrippa would be like, oh my God, you're mixing copper and iron. That's terrible. Like they're enemies, and if you start to look at some of the stuff from Agrippa, you start to see like there's all this folklore on metal that's really fascinating. Copper's fun. I like working with copper. It has its own challenges. I like working with mild steel the most. It's the most fun for me. And if I had more space and there was more of a community of blacksmiths more local to me, that I could be learning more architectural oriented stuff, I'd probably get really into that, because it's such a beautiful and amazingly challenging practice, making like large architectural doorways and gateways and things like that, fences and more candelabras and things like that, that you see in like big lodges and stuff. Like, to me, that's just like, wow. That's
the doorways,
incredible.
With the doorways, I'm envisioning like all of the kind of like threshold magic that you could.
That's
like,
yeah. I mean, and you can do that, like, I think besides the crazy alchemists and magicians that were doing things, blacksmiths did have some, their beliefs as well, and they were considered sorcerers. But after a certain time, I think that became just more of a trade. And you see it today. There's, blacksmiths can be a pretty superstitious bunch, but there's a lot that are just hardcore atheists and scientific materialists. And I think all of what I do is rubbish, which, if I was to be in their worldview, I'd probably think it was rubbish too. But let's move beyond. If we go beyond superstition, we look at it as philosophy. Actually, they were working within a philosophical standpoint, which in alchemy is what we do as well, right? We do scientific things. We do what we call today chemistry, and chemistry originated from that. But just like with blacksmithing, it's philosophical. There's a philosophy behind it. So if you start looking at European folklore and magic throughout Northern Europe, you start seeing a lot of, especially in Germany, where that whole ginger hair and urine for blacksmithing thing sort of originated from. And you start to recognize, oh, they did a lot of stuff with gingers. They were all about it.
Yeah.
And so they were a little ginger obsessed. They had their kind of a ginger kink going on. But you start seeing these patterns of like, oh, well, there was a logic, there's all this stuff that they believe, about gingers. And so then you approach that with the blacksmithing. You're like, I see. Okay. So they saw that there was, like the fire god, or like there's this divine power within, within the ginger, that it cured epilepsy. That's one of the beliefs, right? The other one is that would make steel hard.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. And so they would use these different, beliefs, and there was a philosophy that was going along with it, and trying to unpack that philosophy as from a modern standpoint. It's easy for people to say, oh, well, it's because of the energy.
Right.
It's the vibration of redheads that makes it possible. Yeah. So, I mean,
that makes less sense to me.
Right. But people do that on a regular basis. What is the thing, like chocolate is a higher octave of avocado.
So one of my questions, and for all of the heathens who are listening to this, they might be like, oh, I thought I was listening to a heathen podcast. Why are we talking about alchemy? But I think that your approach is really interesting because it is grounded in kind of like Germanic and Northern European study in a certain way. I mean, you're the Trollcunning Forge, right? So you have experience in that way. One of the things that I find really interesting about your work as well is that you're taking these like concepts of like high ceremonial magic, or at least I think a lot of people who don't know very much about alchemy would consider alchemy to be high magic, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
But then you're also mixing it with that folklore, folk magic, which is often called or considered low magic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually
alchemy is always informing the folk magic traditions as well. Trickle down information. We see it today with the new age stuff, like they keep, with quantum physics, for example, people are always like, well, quantum physics say that this magic is possible because of blah, 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 blah. So,
right.
That same thing it hasn't changed. That was still happening, like back then. So, excuse me, I'm drinking cider. It's making me belchy. So that was happening then. So people were informed. Information did trickle down to people. Grimoires were usually written by, like in Norse. If you want to get really Norse, we could talk about the Black Book traditions. And so the Black Book traditions were oftentimes, there were books. So they were, documentation of literate people. And a lot of the times the people that were literate were clergy. And it was also believed that you had to be clergy in order to have a black book, because that was the only way that you could control the supernatural powers of diabolical, like hell there arose from them. And so like, the way they viewed these books was really amazing, because they were literally like, there's stories of like, one trolldom practitioner, he was, he was a priest, I believe, and he had his book, and if Johannes is reading this, he's probably, that's not the way the story goes. And, but the he was carrying the book or there was like an exorcism or something had to be done. The demon was present, and he sent his student to go get the book. He forgot the book at home, and so he goes back, and he trips and drops the book, and all these evil spirits start flying out of the book like he had just like uncorked a bottle, right? I mean, the way that they saw these books was insane. Like Agrippa's books in some parts of Europe throughout history were actually kept in a locked room and chained. They were chained up so that the evil couldn't escape the book. So they had different views of books back then. Books were considered insanely supernaturally powerful. The written word if you look at how modern heathens view runes and the power of runes, well, the written word itself, it's an alphabet. It makes words, and those have power. And if you look at folk magic philosophy, like the words have a great deal of power. And so books have a great deal of power. It wasn't a huge jump. And for, Scandinavians to fetishize or put so much importance onto the black books and the things that were written inside of them.
I was just going to say, we have in Minnesota here, we have one of the largest collections of black books, like outside of Scandinavia. Like they've actually been.
Have you got a chance to look at them at all? Yeah.
No, because I found out about this after COVID had happened.
Oh.
So I haven't had a chance to take a road trip and like look through them. But they're in like a neighboring city to mine.
Awesome.
And it was just, like immigrants basically whose families had somehow taken the family black book with them overseas. And it was like put in an attic somewhere. And then they opened it and it's like, oh, I guess grandma was doing some demonology or something.
Well, a lot of these black books, it wasn't, for one, if grandma had it, it was probably demonology, because women, according to Scandinavian belief, you had to be a priest and women couldn't be priests. So if a woman had a black book, that means she was a witch. She was doing witchcraft with it because, goes with the territory. Women are inherently evil throughout European history, as we've learned. But I don't actually believe that, but history says that.
Right.
But that was the way it was approached, is that, like folk healers, oftentimes, if a woman was a folk healer, she would get, in trouble if she had a book on magic. But a lot of these things were like, if you look at like Petit Albert, have you seen that grimoire at all?
I haven't.
No. If you look at some of these other more, and some of the Spanish ones that have been translated, the books of Saint Cyprian, which also is another recurring theme in the Scandinavian ones as well, you start to see that there's a recurring theme of, it's almost like an almanac. These black books, they were handwritten, copied, more information was put in, like a journal. It was the grimoire tradition, like as we think of it today, but of the folk people, the common people, the people, and so what was so interesting is that this is like, a lot of it was their answer to not having Viagra. Right. So there was a lot of boner spells and remedies and things like that to get, and how to get your wife, how to meet your wife or your husband. That was another really common thing that you see in these, and just across Europe, you see that over and over again in whatever culture's books that they had. They documented that, but also how to get rid of a toothache. And a lot of these things were practical as well as magical, but there was no crossover, right? Because the crossover didn't exist. There was no divide.
Right.
And that's the thing that people take for granted, like, oh, these are magic books. And I was like, well, an almanac would be considered a magic book, you know, like the Foxfire books today would be like, well, it's got some stories in it, but it's also got some magic, you know, like, because it tells you how to do this and that and the other. But when we don't, certain things we didn't explain things via the scientific, you know, materialistic standpoint, you know, like this idea of science is still relatively new to the human experience as a way of like explaining the world around us. And so how did they explain these things, you know, back then? Well, I think that's really the most interesting and intriguing thing to look at, you know, like, you know, the spells for getting rid of a hernia on a baby. Was that a spell? Was that a magical spell? Or was that just a remedy? It's magic to us. It's definitely magic to us, but there was a logic behind it. Like equals like. Right. The fundamentals of what we call folk magic today, you know, like contagion, you know, like all these laws of contagion, sympathy, you know, like sympathetic magic, all these things. This was just common sense. This is through the observation of nature, like equals like, you know, like opposites attract, things like this. You know, we observe these things and we witness it. And it's not more complicated than that oftentimes.
Right. Well, and I mean, I'm even thinking about, so I've done a little bit of herbalism training and, you know, like from a traditional, like Western herbalism standpoint, you have sympathetic magic all over. Like if this plant kind of looks like an ear, like then it's probably
doctrine
helpful.
Signatures. Yeah.
Yeah. Like it's probably helpful in some kind of like healing of the ear or hearing or something. So what
and that's a cross-cultural human phenomena throughout history. We all do that. All of us have done that. And it's the way of understanding the language of the world. And we've all paid attention to it. And, you know, like throughout history, I think until now. And now we have specialists that do it in a very special mathematical manner that, you know, if it doesn't work within those the precepts of their imagination as to how things should work, then, you know, it can't be validated, then it's not true. But I think that's ridiculous.
Yeah, I think that there's an interesting thing that I've been, you know, thinking about, and also like it's coming up in our conversation too, is that this like idea that high magic is somehow separate from like folk culture is just kind of ludicrous, because the people who were practicing and developing high magic were a part of their folk cultures. Like they just were. So like the folk culture of, you know, the German or Swedish or Greek magician, you know, informs their worldview. And then that's kind of like how, you know, like how it springs. So it's really, the more I think about it, the more like these distinctions between high and low magic don't really make that much sense to me, because they're always informing each other. If you look at
some of these grimoires, I mean, they're within these grimoires, there's solid chunks from, you know, bits and pieces of the Book of Solomon. We had people that were doing what, you know, people call ceremonial in their own way. And they had little chunks of different grimoires, you know, that people look at for their high magic stuff today. So these folk magicians that were doing low magic, which we could just throw that out. You know, the high magic, low magic thing to me is it's a pretty classist idea, you know, and once again, it comes from a complete stance of privilege, you know, like you have these, I mean, if you look at God, was it Agrippa? I can't remember who, but there was these, Eric Perdue's one of my best friends. He's a translator of Agrippa, and he's pointed out several times that, you know, there was these standards for what you had to have in your life and life experiences to be a magician. You had to be pretty much independently wealthy. You had to have like served in the military for some time. You had to have like your own manor house and servants and all these different things. You know, it just, the list went on and on and on and on and on and on. And those were the prerequisites. You needed to have those things in order to be a magician. And that's, it's just ridiculous.
Right.
And
I don't even know.
And the results of a lot of what these guys were trying to do with their high magic, a lot of times just like, what, all right, treasure finding, like divination. Really, these guys had just really oftentimes, and still today, they delude themselves into thinking that it has to be as complicated and difficult and challenging as possible in order for it to be effective or to even work in the first place.
Yeah.
And in my experience and from studying magic from a cross-cultural standpoint and historically, that's inaccurate. Very inaccurate. So,
and honestly, like the folk magicians who were, seeing clients and treating people, the cunning folk or the troll cunning or whatever tradition they're coming from, like they had and have such an intense variety of like experiences of like kinds of magic that they were doing. Whereas like a high ceremonial magician, I would almost think like wouldn't have that same diversity and skill set.
No, not magically, because they had too many limitations. I mean, people spend like years trying to meet their guardian angel, like their own personal guardian angel, like it's absurd to me. Personally, I think it's a lot easier than they think it is. But, and, if you work with some of these Peruvian shamans, you'll see that that's true, that it is a lot easier, but it takes more intensive work in some ways, I think.
Totally.
But regardless of that, I think that, you see these people doing quote unquote high magic, though I really don't talk about this subject very often because I find it highly obnoxious. But the people that do it, they're petitioning spirits, either divine or infernal, a lot of times in order to accomplish specific things. And it seems a lot of the results are psychologized, that what they're seeking, or rationalized as being psychologized in an altered state of consciousness or what have you. Like you're not literally flying. This demon that gives you the gift of flying, it's not really flying. It's an altered state of consciousness where you're actually having the experience, or more like a creative visualization of a clairvoyant flight. It's not literal. These primitive people that we are obsessed about studying their magic of, they viewed it as literal. But we're smarter than them, though we're obsessed with them and what they knew.
Right.
Yeah. So there's so many contradictions to me. But at the same time, you look at the humble practitioners, working in the village, doing what they did. They interacted with all manner of supernatural entities to accomplish whatever they needed to at the time, or didn't. Or spent all their time trying not to,
right.
Or being an intermediary once again, between the supernatural world and the physical world, to solve problems.
So, so I think we probably don't have much more time to talk. So if there are any listeners who are interested in learning more alchemy for themselves or like more kind of this folk magic and practical alchemy aspect of it, where should they look?
I would say you should, if you are interested in alchemy, you should take Robert Bartlett's course, Prima, and then Secunda, and then Tertia. It's 3 different courses. He has them recorded, which really is only a substitute. It's not a substitute, actually, for being there and taking the classes. Each class is different. You're going to learn so much more every time. He's a treasure trove of information and knowledge. But the hands-on experience of actually doing the lab work is extremely valuable. I could take all of those classes over and over again and learn new things. every time. So I highly recommend that. Robert Bartlett, he wrote the book, several books. He has a new one that has been released on the humors by Revelor Press. That was it's really fascinating, doing destructive distillations to discover what the four humors of a thing is. He spoke at our conference, the British Genii Symposium, on the subject one year, and it absolutely blew my mind. Really incredible work. He's a genius. He's a great guy. I love him. He's my alchemy teacher, my maestro, and I love that guy. If you want to learn about the synergy of sorcery and alchemy, so the folk magic and witchcraft aspects of it, I highly recommend finding a copy of the Viridarium Umbris, as well as Ars Filtron by Daniel Schulke. That's a Three Hands Press or Zoanon release. Those books are extremely expensive now and hard to come by, so you'll probably only be able to nail like a PDF or something like that of them, which won't give you all the information a lot of times, but most of it. But that'll give you somewhat of an idea of where sorcery and folk magic and witchcraft synergized with alchemy. But that's really his own praxis. That's Schulke's praxis, which is great, but that's not the end-all be-all. And so it shouldn't be fetishized as being the end-all be-all or the ultimate or, the best even. It's his, and what he's learned from his teachers, as well. Then I would say to get a really good understanding of folk magic, I would study or read Trolldom by Johannes Skarsbeck, and actually, he's teaching classes, and so I would pursue his courses and study with him. I've learned a lot from him over the years. Consider him a friend, and he's hopefully we'll get him to speak at the British Genii Symposium in the future. That would be great. I know he's working on some interesting new stuff too. But yeah, he's got a really great grasp. And I would also, seek out old people that still know some of this stuff. And I would also, if you want to understand American folk magic more, Professor Porterfield is a treasure trove of information on that subject. We're in America. If you're an American, you were born here, you live here, you're an American. And no matter where your ancestors were from or where they were born, you're an American and you're from here. No matter what your heritage is, you can explore all that stuff as much as you want. That's great, but you're still an American. And Americans have a history for hundreds of years that's also valuable. And there's a lot of things that people have learned in America and have adapted to being an American that's really interesting and shouldn't be ignored. And so American folk magic is really fascinating and has a very fascinating history. And the Scandinavian folk magic, there's a really good book. I think you probably know it on, I think it was focused around Minnesota, but it was Scandinavian folk healers and immigration to North America. I can't remember what the name. I think it might have just been called folk healer or folk medicine or.
I know of one called Rituals and Remedies.
Yeah, that's it. That's the book. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah. That's a great book on the subject. That was that. Yeah, that's a really good one as well. Just to see where that was going. I would also check out for more Scandinavian folk magic stuff. Revelor Press has also released a extremely large black book, and so I think that it's got a lot of information in it. I will absolutely butcher the name, but I would go to Revelor Press and look at their website and look up their black book. It's got a lot of really great information, a lot of shotgun magic, and a lot of magic for making people poop, which is good stuff to know.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. Scandinavians really love their poop curses, and cursing people's shotguns. I like to think, as someone with Swedish heritage, we were probably pretty good at it.
Yeah. That's fantastic. All right, Marcus. So my last question for you is, what are you working on right now that you're excited about? What can people kind of, look forward to coming from you in the future? Obviously, I encourage everybody to follow Trollcunning Forge. I have been personally coveting some knives for a long time, but just trying to get
I've got
the money
a new series
together.
of knives coming soon. I've got the designs made and very excited about releasing them. They're going to be somewhat based upon what I've been producing, the Athames that I've been making, but they're going to be working with a particular type of steel that turns black, really nice black. And so they're going to be a black blade with a black handle. So that'll be a lot of fun. And then, so it's one of the things I'm really excited about that's coming up. That I'll be releasing within this winter. Then this Monday, I'm actually going to be doing a limited batch of algal blades, which is working from talismanic magic with fixed stars. And so it's still working with alchemical philosophy. So instead of locking these principles of the intelligence of the star within a talisman like this one, which is an algal talisman, we'll be locking it within a blade. And so we'll also have the working with a particular method that Agrippa talked about with my friend Eric Perdue, where you find the name of the ruling spirits and sigils of the ruling spirits at the time. So we'll have that information available to the buyers so that they'll be able to command and commune with the spirits and have their name in the sigil, which is how you command and commune with spirits traditionally. And so we'll have these algal talisman daggers that we'll be producing and releasing. But it has to be done on Monday during a specific astrological time that's called an election. And what that does is that it crystallizes those astrological forces that happen at that moment, where algal has got its most influential power during that day, into the steel. And so algal will be in there. Now, the exciting thing is that we're actually using Robert Bartlett's oil of diamond.
Ooh.
So this is diamond oil. This is an oil made from diamonds, right? And black hellebore in the quench. So the properties of which is what are traditionally used in algal talismans. So this will be literally an algal talisman with those virtues of diamond and hellebore infused within the steel, so that the algal planetary or fixed star intelligence will be more at home, basically.
So how much information do you kind of like include with your orders about this stuff? Because you're like a wealth of knowledge on this. And I also imagine that if somebody is kind of an unsuspecting knife buyer, and they get something that is, like the imbued with the spirit, they might want a few pointers on it. So what do you include?
I don't include any information, actually.
Really?
And I'm actually, a lot of people do. A lot of people include a lot of information, and that's a double-bladed sword, so to speak, in that in the not too distant past, the law really cracked down on people that were selling magical things because they made a lot of claims. And we're probably headed that direction again because people are assholes, both the consumers and the sellers. And so both are exploiting each other because the the buyer right now is trying to circumvent a teacher by buying magic from a supplier. And the suppliers recognize this, and they set themselves up as gurus that can give you this magical thing, that can do these magical things for you and change your life. And, they may not make claims, but it's the way that they don't make claims that makes a claim. Right. And there's a lot of that going on. And that was illegal, and it still is illegal. But people are doing it anyway. People are still doing it, and they're exploiting each other. And there are people that are in this industry just to exploit people and to con people. And there are task force that do that for psychic reading and stuff. And it's just a matter of time before they start doing it for magical products again. In history, they did it in the past, and they'll do it again. So to avoid that, I respect the practitioner in becoming an informed buyer, and I can direct people if they ask me personally, like where they can find information, but I don't provide that information because the people that are selling things and providing all the information on how to use it and what to do with it and stuff like that, God bless some of them, because I think that they have their hearts in the right place and they have the best intentions. I really do. But I think that it's a slippery slope, and that the route that a lot of people are going, because the esoteric marketplace has become vast right now. It's a huge market, huge, way larger than it was when I first started. And it's going to end in tears.
Yeah. That's so interesting that you bring that up, because I hadn't quite put that together, but I actually, so I do tarot readings and rune readings as a part of my business, if you will, but I can't actually accept any payments via Stripe online, because they crack down on psychic readings and stuff. And so I actually
it's actually in a lot of city ordinances that psychic readings are against the law. Yeah. They don't enforce it like they used to. But I mean, there's a fictional show called Shut Eye. Right? I think it's on Hulu or something like that. But people should watch that, because it's a look at magic fraud that has existed for a really long time and still continues to exist. There's actually reputable companies that are still practicing magic fraud to this day. Reputable, but right. They exist and they're out there. But the cons, those particular cons, are very much used by people, cold readers, things like that. And so to protect the populace, they just consider all of us frauds, And we're going to be in that category with the popularity and the way people are being so brazen with the way that we approach the psychic and spiritual marketplace. We're on our way to getting that enforced again. I guarantee it.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I've already seen it a little bit personally.
So I think a way to avoid that from happening, encourage people, empower people to find teachers, encourage and empower teachers to be teachers that haven't become a teacher yet, but have it within them to be a teacher. Be questionable, or be critical of people that just because they're an author doesn't mean that they know anything. Just because they wrote a book doesn't mean they know shit. Right. And, because there are some trash books out there, man. And question what someone's motivation is for selling you the stuff that they sell and teaching what they teach.
Yeah.
I think that's huge. Questioning try to figure out what their motives are. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, again, thank you so much for sharing your stream of consciousness and ideas with the listeners. I am excited to talk to you again.
Likewise. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed the interview. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, I will talk to you later.
Okay. Have a good night.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
And that is it for today's episode of the Heathen's Journey podcast. A huge thank you and shout out to all of my students and patrons for making this work available. If you want to become a patron and support the podcast, head on over to patreon.com/northernlightswitch. I post full moon and new moon ritual guides, rune readings for each of the turning of the zodiac season, and so much more. If you would like to follow me in between episodes, you can find me on Instagram at northern.lights.witch or on Twitter at northlightwitch. Until next time, stay weird.